very exciting to be editing Hypatia at this point. It's a real honor. When we wrote our proposal for this editorship, we put in it, front and center, special initiatives. We had to have a 25th birthday party. This opening panel we titled A Journal of Her Own, Hypatia Founders and Editors. And the idea was to get together a panel of people who had edited the journal, who were involved in the original editorial collective that came out of SWIP, was part of SWIP, that created the journal initially, as I said, as 3 special issues of International Women's Studies Forum that appeared between 1983 and 1985. The editor, the founding editor who oversaw this initial publication of Hypatia as a special issue of WSIF was Aziza Al-Hibri, who sadly can't be with us tonight, but has sent us a video. And so we'll be showing that. Aziza was this founding editor. The tables of contents for those first issues are a who's who of feminist philosophers who shaped the field and sustained Hypatia ever since. Since founding Hypatia, Aziza's gone on to a long and distinguished career in the law, in the law school. She's a professor of law at the T.C. Williams School of Law, University of Richmond. She works on women's rights, especially Muslim women's rights. Recent publications include articles with titles like this, An Islamic Perspective on Domestic Violence, Redefining Muslim Women's Roles in the Next Century, Islamic Jurisprudence and Critical Race Feminism. But her law school bio sketch, which she has online in her law school, faculty bio webpage, makes it clear that her roots and her heart are still in feminist philosophy. Here's the first line of that bio sketch. Aziza Al-Hibri is a former professor of philosophy, founding editor of Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy, and founder and president of HARMA, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. So let's start with Aziza's video, and then I'll be introducing panelists in ones and twos as we go.
Good morning. I'm really happy to be celebrating with you this wonderful anniversary of Hypatia. When it started, we had no idea how long it would last, whether it would last. Actually, the very foundation of Hypatia was a great challenge and a story of hope and determination and collective action that I would like to discuss with you today. In around the early 1980s, 80-81, I was invited to speak at the National Women's Studies Association on Islam and women. The panel was extremely successful, but in the audience, it so happened there was a wonderful woman, Dale Spender, who worked with Pergamon Press. Dale came to me and said, Aziza, I'd like to offer you 3 book contracts with Pergamon to write about Islam. Any other topics you please. For somebody who was very young and starting a career in philosophy, actually I think at that time I was assistant professor, it was quite an offer, as you all understand. And I was very pleased with it. I think it was around that time or soon thereafter that I became a visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis through the efforts of my dear friend, Joyce Treble-Cott, whom we all remember very fondly. I ran to Joyce and I told her the great news. And I also told her that I really didn't think at this stage in my life that I wanted to write 3 books on Islam and some other topic. I would like to do 1 on Islam and women, but most likely I'm not going to pick up the other 2 offers. And Joyce said to me at that point, Aziza, SWIP, Society for Women in Philosophy, with whom I participated from the very first meeting they had, and I think it was in Chapel Hill where I read the paper. She said, SWIP has been discussing lately the importance of having a feminist philosophy journal. And it has been very difficult to be able to find any publisher who's interested in this proposition, first because they think there isn't much market for it, and secondly because the general market for journals has gone way down. This is a really bad time to be starting a journal. So maybe instead of doing a book and dropping the other two offers, maybe you could talk to Dale about the possibility of establishing a journal for feminist philosophy. Well, that was a nice and creative idea by Joyce, and I liked it for sure. So I went back to Dale and I said, you know, I'm going to do a book on Islam and women. And by the way, that book did get done and published. But instead of the two other contracts, how about if we consider together the founding of a feminist philosophy journal? And Dale then repeated to me what Joyce has mentioned, namely that journals are not doing very well generally in the market at that time, and that it would take a great deal of effort to convince any publisher that a journal of feminist philosophy would have a considerable market that would justify it commercially. Well, but Dale was also an enterprising woman. See, there are three women that played a really important role in this matter, as well as Webb. Dale was the editor of Women's Studies International Forum, a quarterly published by Pergamon Press. She offered to let our journal piggyback off her journal by giving us one issue a year to establish the extent of a market of readership for feminist philosophy. If we succeed, then we will find a publisher. How about that, Dale said. And I thought, well, great. You know, it'll give us at least a starting chance. So we decided to go ahead with it. I told Joyce, and Joyce contacted SWIP, and SWIP discussed it, and we all agreed that this is what we should do. It was about that time that I had decided that I really wanted to go to law school. I was already teaching, as I mentioned, at Washington University in St. Louis, visiting from Texas A&M University, where I had a tenure track position. And I had written a lot about women's issues, but I decided that in order to change things, maybe we should also be looking at law. So I decided to go to law school. And that came just about the time that I reached the deal with Dale Spender for the journal. By the way, the name Hypatia has raised a lot of questions. A lot of people call me and ask, why did you choose the name Hypatia? Who is Hypatia? The fact of the matter is that I did not choose that name. SWIP chose it. The editorial board sat together and considered the various names they would like to give the journal. And Hypatia was an ancient Egyptian philosopher who struggled against patriarchy. But SWIP chose her because it shows that women have deep roots in philosophy, historical roots, and were not born yesterday. So it was SWIP who chose the name Hypatia, not I. And then we decided to move forward with the first issue. But by that time, I had already applied to law schools. I had already been accepted at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. And the first year of law school, as some of you might have heard, is the toughest. It takes all your time. So it was really, in some ways, bad timing. There's no way I could launch a journal and pass a first year of law school at the same time. So I decided to be a little bit enterprising. And I went to the philosophy department at Penn, which was also the department from which I graduated with my PhD. I talked to some of my professors, told them about the idea of the journal and how important it would be for Penn to house that journal, and indeed they decided to give me some support. They gave me research assistance. The space then came from the Women's Studies program, which was on the ground floor of the building in which the philosophy department was. So I negotiated with two programs, the philosophy department, and then I went to Women's Studies and said, hey, you know, the philosophy department is giving me research students, you know, TAs and RAs. Wouldn't you give me space and maybe a phone and, you know, things like that? And they agreed. So through the collaborative efforts at Penn of philosophy and women's studies, I was able to have the setup for the journal Hypatia, the very first issue. Now came the hard part. What are we going to do? How do we call for papers? Who edits the papers? Who reviews them? You know, all of this. And one of the students I got through the philosophy department was Donna Catadal. Now she has a different last name. And Donna was very energetic, and she agreed to be responsible for the first issue. I believe Ruth Schwartz was willing to do the second issue, and so on. They're all philosophy students. And remember, we were doing one issue a year. We issued a call for paper, we followed with phone calls. It was a lot of hard work. And in the meantime, I slowly disappeared from the scene as the law school became more demanding. So I have to say that Donna Catadal was responsible for the first issue. I guess I was the visionary, along with Joyce and Swip and Dale, to bring together the birth of Hypatia, to think about ways to make it happen. However, it was the dogged efforts of Donna day and night, and her team. There was a team with her of philosophy students who helped her quite a bit. It was not a single person's effort to put together that first journal issue, and it was a pleasure to see it come out. After the first issue, we were so pleased and ready and pumped up to go into the second year, and we did that. And then the question came, I was going to graduate, I was going to be a lawyer, and what are we going to be doing with Hypatia? The arrangement I had made was sort of temporary while I was there. Somebody needs to lead it full time. Hypatia was becoming established, which is what we had hoped for. We had proven slowly that in fact there is a market, in fact there is a readership, and that the journal is quite well regarded, even in the first two issues. So how are we going to stabilize the journal, give it deeper roots, and make it go on more permanently? So these were the issues we were discussing. I have to say that the burden on Donna, Ruth, and others of putting together two issues while they are being doctoral students at Penn was quite hard and quite heavy. And they made real sacrifices that we should all be appreciative of. And so the question was as important to them as it was to the rest of us. At that time, Peg Simon volunteered to do the third issue, and in fact did one on Simone de Beauvoir, and while doing it, managed to get her institution interested enough in Hypatia to offer to take it off the hands of Pergamon Press and to start publishing Hypatia as an independent journal all on its own. So whatever we had hoped for in terms of establishing a journal for women in philosophy, which is the authentic voice of feminists in the field, and to prove that it has a respectable market, has happened. In a short period of time, we were able to win the confidence of the institution at which Peg Simon taught, and they offered to publish Hypatia so that it will no longer be a piggyback of another journal published by Pergamon Press. And so Hypatia came of age, or let's say Hypatia was reborn on another campus. To save the earlier issues that were published as part of another journal, Peg edited this volume, Hypatia Reborn, in which the first 3 volumes that were piggybacking of the other journal were collected. So now you can get a full set of Hypatia journal and issues as you please. As you see, it was not an easy task to establish this journal. The market conditions were against it. The publishers were very skeptic, highly skeptic. We did not have our own independent sources of funds. But what we had was a determination that this was an important endeavor, that we women should have our authentic voice, that we should speak for ourselves, not through filters of other journals who might or might not accept our point of view. And to that effect, to bring about this dream, many, many women, some in philosophy and some not, like Dale Spender, decided to join hands and make it happen. Some were students, some were faculty, some were publishers. But it was through the efforts of many women acting as one hand that made this happen. So I'm very glad that SWIP in the early 80s had the vision about the journal and about establishing it. I'm glad that I spoke at NUSA, National Women's Studies Association, on a topic that inspired Dale to offer me those contracts. I'm very glad that I was a good friend of Joyce Treblecott, who then suggested to me that maybe this is how we can get to have the journal we've always talked about. I'm very lucky to have had the University of Pennsylvania support us, and enthusiastic women students at the University of Pennsylvania philosophy department who were willing to sacrifice a great deal of their time and effort to put together these issues. So thanks to all of them, we now have this journal that is celebrating its wonderful anniversary. Thank you so much, and I hope it goes on and only gets better.
Anne Gary was a member of the founding collective that created Hypatia back in the day. And she's going to speak next. She and Linda Lopez McAllister are going to, I think Anne's will be the primary speaker, and then Linda's, this is out of chronological order because Linda was then an editor 2 editorial terms on. So I want to introduce them both together. After Anne speaks with input from Linda, then Peg Simons will speak, and it's Peg who hosted the journal at, I always mix up the title here, Southern Illinois University of Edwardsville. For some reason I constantly call it the Southern University of Illinois. Anyway, I do better with the initials, SIU Edwardsville. So then Peg and then Lori Schrey will speak after that. So I'll be introducing in this sort of back and forth order. Anne Gary is a professor of philosophy at California State University in LA, and I believe has taught there since 1969.
Yeah.
Yeah, even before Hypatia was founded. She's a founding associate editor of Hypatia, excuse me, and a long-serving member of the advisory board, is currently a member of the advisory board. She's been active from the very beginning as a member, as I said, of the collective that founded the journal in the mid-70s that began to put in motion the development that founded the journal. And most recently, she's been the co-editor with Tali Betcher of a magnificent special issue of Hypatia that Hilda Lindemann, the previous editor, just previous to the three of us currently editing, assembled and was published just this past summer. The title is Transgender Studies and Feminism, Theory, Politics, and Gendered Reality. So that's out in print and available now. So Anne's been active with the journal from forever, and we just have our claws in her. She's never going to escape special issues. She's published on a range of feminist issues in bioethics, pornography, philosophy of law, as well as in analytic feminist epistemology and on philosophical method. Linda Lopez McAllister is professor of philosophy and women's studies at the University of South Florida. She represents an editorial team that hosted Hypatia at the University of South Florida for 8 years. Most of the editorial teams terms are 5 years long. That also included Joanne Watt and Cheryl Hall, who joined Linda as co-editors between 95 and 98. Linda was involved also in the early 70s in meetings of SWIP, where the idea of Hypatia was conceived. And working with German women philosophers, she also played an instrumental role in the formation of the International Association of Women Philosophers. Her intellectual roots are in German philosophy. She's a Brentano scholar, perhaps best known in feminist circles for her 1996 book, Hypatia's Daughters, 1,500 years of women philosophers. She retired in 1999 and has since returned to her other roots in theater. She's now a theatrical and radio producer-director in New Mexico, and mentions in her bio that her company, Camino Real Productions, is producing plays in Albuquerque, and they go on tour. De San Miguel de Allende, am I saying that? Yeah, Allende, Mexico. I'm Canadian, I do French, I'm not very good on Spanish. So, welcome to the two of you.
Not to him, not to him. So, in the beginning, no, the part that I'm going to talk about is how we went from nothing to something. And where is Jackie Thomason? She's here. Would you stand up, Jackie? Jackie plays an integral role in all of this. There are other members of the early collective too here. Sandra Harding, Alison Jagger, Helen Longino, maybe others too. And we'll have them, you know, have a chance to talk too. But I wanted to particularly, since Jackie left the Academy a long time ago, and I hunted her down. It took a long time. When in Aziza's tape, you see what she was able to do. So it really started in 1972. Linda, why don't you come over here? Okay. We were, Eastern SWIP began talking about it then. Do you want to say a couple things about Eastern SWIP?
Yeah, Jackie Thomason and Ann Ferguson called what I think was the first meeting of Eastern SWIP in Northampton in 1972, and there was some talk at that meeting, or talk about lots of things, but one of the ideas that came up was a journal. And then the following spring, the next Eastern SWIP meeting was at Barnard, and that's where the name Hypatia surfaced for the first time, although there's a long history of going back and forth about that name. But somebody said, oh, Linda named it Hypatia.
I thought you did.
Yeah, I didn't. Actually, it was Sue Larson, who was a philosopher at Barnard, who was never part of SWIP and never active in all of this. But because the meeting was at Barnard and she taught there, she was at the meeting, and she heard that we were thinking about founding a journal, and she said, you ought to call it Hypatia. And me, being interested in history of women in philosophy, thought that was a terrific idea. So I'm the one who pushed it for 10 years. So this is the 25th anniversary of Hypatia, but for us it's like the 37th anniversary.
It was a long pregnancy, a very long pregnancy.
Meanwhile, on the West Coast.
On the West Coast, what I have here, now, you're not really appreciating it because it was purple. Remember, I mean, a lot of you are not old enough, but a lot of you are old enough. The purple Ditto Masters, the original that I have at home is light purple, and it's getting lighter and lighter. Okay. But this, up at the top, it says 1975 on it, so I assume that's when it was. But you'll see that among the things, first of all, we started in 73, and Claire Bright, who is here, had chaired the meeting at the APA in Seattle. So in telling our accomplishments during 74, 75, we commenced formulation of an editorial policy. And then it says, Jackie's going to make an announcement. Okay. All right. So we commenced, but we agonized. And we commenced and we agonized. Okay. So so that was 74, 75. There's an Eastern APA, Eastern SWIP at the APA agenda of 75 that I apparently made a report at it, and it says in my handwritten notes, send all comments to Jackie. So everyone in the country was supposed to, you know, send everything to her. Then I'm not going to show some of these documents. It's going to take a while. But in 76, there's a letter I wrote to Joyce Treblecott. Let me get that one up. That's. I'm putting this up to remind you that we didn't have computers yet. from the Midwest. We didn't have internet, we didn't have computers, we didn't have faxes even, we didn't have email. It's a miracle that this all happened, right? But that is one reason it was so slow, because you know how people don't answer their email within a time? Well, they don't answer letters either, right? So it took a really long time. But so I just want to put this up if you've got a chance to look at it a little bit. Just to give you the sense of how we were doing it, you know, it was the 70s. It was all collective. We were feminists. There should be total democracy.
Yes.
And what's the relation to SWIP? And so this is tricky. And how do people get, does each division in SWIP get a representative? Well, that's not really going to work, because what if they don't get along, you know? And every organization in SWIP from the beginning, including Midwest, I'm sure they talked about it there too. We just don't have any documents in our hands about that. I do have a Midwest SWIP meeting, 1976. That should be in here too, the next page. A journal proposal. This is 1976. The arguments for having a journal. Arguments for restricting the journal to women authors. Then on the next page, whoops.
Oh dear.
Where'd it go? That's bizarre.
So back up.
No, this is a 32-page. This is 3 out of 25. Well, on the next page are the other sides of that. Well, no, you can't just have women authors arguments. But there were quite a few issues about what kind of journal it was going to be. Do you want to say something about
Right.
that?
When I was looking at the archives, I came across, much to my chagrin, a letter that I had written in 1980 when I was working at San Diego State in the Imperial Valley, and I must have caught some of the feeling of the Imperial Valley because I sounded very imperious in this letter, and it was quite embarrassing. But one of the things that I said, well, I was frustrated because we'd started in 1972, it was now 1980, and while all of this stuff had been going on, nothing really had happened. And one of the issues that I referred to in that letter was irreconcilable political differences on the advisory board, that there are some of us who want to see it be an academic journal, a sort of signs for philosophy, and some of them who want to see it be a philosophical sinister wisdom. And the twain is never going to meet.
Some people are not old enough to remember.
They're not old enough to know what. What shall I say? Sinister Wisdom was a pretty radical lesbian feminist publication. So that was one of the problems, and then there was the political divide. Somebody said in one of these things, "Oh, you can't possibly let those people publish it because they're liberals and so they're sexist." So you're never going to find a publisher if that's your criterion. And we looked long and hard, and finally, somehow, some of these issues got worked out.
Okay, so we're not going to be showing very many more documents. So now, we were going around the country talking to people, trying to get people together. Finally, Jackie Thomason and I put a call out for volunteers and nominations of other people to have an editorial board. And the idea was it would be across the country. Okay, and how did we do this? Well, we had a SWIP newsletter, which was also kind of purple. Sometimes it was the other way of doing it. There were blue waxy things you typed on. They were mimeographs, they were called.
Yeah.
Okay. And sometimes they were that. That was the high-priced one. Okay. But so we just word of mouth, meetings, talking to people and so forth. So we got a lot of people asking to be on the editorial board. And so what we did, it really wasn't democratic at that point because somebody just had to do it. And so we just did it. We had it on the floor, so we put, okay, the West Coast, Midwest, Canada. We did have someone from Canada, the East Coast. And then we tried to balance their philosophical areas of interest, their politics, because the politics was a very big issue. I mean, how radical a journal was it going to be and so forth. Who was straight, who was a lesbian. This was very important too. And that's how we did it. And I had a screen here with everyone's name on it. Allison, can you just say all the names of the people?
Yeah, or let me give you the copy.
Okay. Because I didn't think I was going to have all the names because oh, wait a minute, maybe I do.
Here you are.
Okay.
And here's a bunch of others too, if you want to.
Okay, Sandra Barkey, Ann Gary, Candace Grudine, Sandra Harding, Sarah Hoagland, Allison Jagger, Helen Longino, Linda McAllister, Catherine Morgan, she was the only Canadian, Janice Moulton, Connie Crank Price, Jackie Thomason, and Joyce Treblecott. So that was the very first group. That was, we sent them their letters in May of '77. So you see, this is still a long time ago. And then after that, we kept trying to get people together, but rarely could we get more than 3 or 4 people in one place. And so whichever of us could get together, we worked on the policy, we formulated editorial policy, which has circles and arrows inscribed and so forth. Then the meeting where things actually, there's also a long letter from Jackie in August of '78 saying we need a division of labor. And she spelled out a lot of different people doing a lot of different things. Somebody's going to work on funding. Somebody's working on legal things. Somebody's working on communication among people. Somebody's trying to figure out how to pay for it. That was her job and my job. We were going to find a publisher and pay for it. Then in '79, April of '79, at an APA meeting in Denver, we got 6 of us together. That was, okay. Sandy Bartkey, Helen, Janice Moulton, Joyce Treblecott, Connie Price, and I were at that meeting. And by then we knew that Aziza was interested. And so since we were the designated group to choose an editor, we decided to choose her. I mean, we had to technically have her submit a proposal, but the letter that I sent to her thanking her for being willing to be editor-in-chief was sent about 2.5 weeks after that meeting, so we obviously didn't take long to. And so then you heard from Aziza what happened, but there was a little stage in there. We did pursue Aziza and a handful of us, again, who could get together whenever it was. We pursued making a deal with Sage Publishing, but they thought a journal like this would never get off the ground. But we had a great proposal to them. It was really well put together, and it just shows they were wrong. And so the founding editorial board, about half of those people really have hung in with the journal all these years. And in fact, when some editors, I think it was Lori and Nancy maybe, suggested that we might want to have terms on but at some point we began to be called associate editors. I mean, in the beginning we weren't called that. And we thought, oh yeah, that was a good idea, to have terms, right? But I noticed, looking back at these old documents, in the very beginning, we had suggested that the terms were only 5 years, and then we totally forgot it. So I finally got off the associate editor board in 2005. So that's it. Did you have something else to say?
No, except that in the early 80s, when they were trying to find publishers, they went out to lots and lots of them, but either the publishing houses didn't do journals, or they were afraid because journals weren't doing very well, and the idea of starting a new journal petrified them. So we got a lot of no's.
Yeah.
And then somebody, and I forget who it was, did some research that the only thing that was doing well at that time was women's studies stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think we were absolutely saved by Dale Spender and Women's Studies International
Absolutely.
Forum
Yeah.
by letting us have those 3 issues where we could have a track record and then go to these publishers and make it happen. And they could see that it was a good journal and that it was going to sell.
Yep.
Yeah, those were the 2 things they needed. Now, then along comes PEG.
Okay.
So the journal started as 3 special issues, International or Women's Studies International Forum, and then Margaret A. Simons became the first editor of the journal as a freestanding autonomous journal. Peg Simons is Distinguished Research Professor Emerita in Philosophy at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. She hosted the editorial office at SIU at Edwardsville from 1984 to 1990. As first term as the editor of Hypatia as an autonomous journal. She's, of course, well known for her work on Simone de Beauvoir. Her own book, Beauvoir and the Second Sex, appeared in 1999, and I remember that very clearly because I happened to be across the river at WashU at the time. She's edited and translated a number of Beauvoir's publications. I note that Simone de Beauvoir served on Hypatia's editorial board from 1983 to 1987. I assume that had to do with you. And that Peg edited what I believe was the first thematic special issue of Hypatia on Simone de Beauvoir. It was the second of the 3 WSIF issues, appeared in 1984. So she was already doing editing for Hypatia before she took on the journal sort of full time. Yeah.
To start the same way that Aziza started, and that's with Joyce. Because if it hadn't been for Joyce Treblecott, who was on the board, I would not have been involved in Hypatia as early as I was. My involvement began in 1982. But Joyce had taken me under her wing back in '76 when I got my job at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And she used to send me these wonderful little postcards. Hooray, it's spring! You know, she was just sweet. You know, she really very nice to me. And I think she must have introduced me to Aziza. Well, in '81, I met Deirdre Baer, who was working on Beauvoir, and Deirdre was planning a big conference at University of Pennsylvania in '86 on Simone de Beauvoir, and asked me to put together the philosophy panels. So at that point, Aziza was already starting law school, and Joyce had introduced us, and Aziza agreed to kind of help me sort of work with the organizers at Penn in putting together this conference, although, as Aziza said, she was taking on far too much, didn't have time to do it. So at a certain point, we were pulling together all these philosophers, none of whom are really interested in Beauvoir. The idea was to encourage people to get interested in Beauvoir. Remember, Claudia? And so we had this wonderful program together, and at some point, Aziza said to me, or I said to Aziza, let's do a special issue. Yes, that was really great. So then actually the conference fell apart, and we thought, no, the conference is not falling apart because we're going to use this as a special issue. And it's a big excitement there at Penn as we pulled off the conference in April of '84. In '82, Aziza must have asked me if I could get Beauvoir to join on the editorial board. So I have a letter that I wrote to her, and Beauvoir wrote back and said, I'd be glad. I don't have time to read any manuscripts, she said, but I'd be glad to serve on the editorial board, just as, you know, lend you my support, which is very sweet. So then after that, I guess I paid my dues. I got invited to be on the editorial board myself. The following month after I got Beauvoir on the board, they invited me to join the editorial board. So that was how I first got involved in 1982. Then when Aziza got really busy and realized she couldn't continue, and they were going to have to find a new editor, it was Joyce who encouraged me to apply to be editor. And I remember her critiquing my proposal. You know, I'd send it to her, and she'd, oh no, you've got to explain who you are and why you should do it. And what surprised me at the time was there was no mention in that proposal of June of '84 that I would publish it. I was just talking about being an editor. We were still assuming in June of '84 that it would be coming out of Pergamon Press. Well, it wasn't but a month later that I'd figured out, talking to Dale Spender, who I also knew, because I'd published my Silencing of Simone de Beauvoir article in Women's Studies International Forum. I had experience very much like Aziza had. They were wonderful to us. National Women's Studies Association was, it was a great place for networking back in the day when there weren't a lot of feminist philosophers. Anyway, Dale told me they could not accommodate an increased production schedule for Hypatia. It was going to be one a year. And we knew that we could not launch as an autonomous journal. We would never establish a presence for ourselves that way. So we had to do something. I'll never forget Joyce's face when I said to her, "Oh, hell, I'll just do it myself." She was utterly appalled. I don't know why, it's just crazy. I thought I could do it. One of the reasons was I was a friend with Claire Moses. I was on the Associate Editor's Board of Feminist Studies, and Claire had been editing it for a long time, and she said, "Oh, yeah, you could do it." And then also, Papers on Language and Literature. Oh my God, what an eloquent journal, and it published at SIU Edwardsville. They do the publication, the typesetting, the subscription fulfillment. They do it all on campus. Well, they gave me all the forms, to track the manuscript, and they had subscription forms, and I thought, well, they were very encouraging. I thought, well, we can do it too. So we started raising money. We got individuals from SWIP. Lots of people gave money, wrote checks, gave us money. Hamilton College. Who was it who was at Hamilton College? It was Libby Potter.
No, it was actually my senior colleague, Betty Ring, who actually failed to get tenure at Hamilton.
But got me $400 for Hypatia?
She was there when it counted, and Hamilton had the money, and Betty Ring got it. She got a name you'll know, but that's who it was.
That's wonderful. I found this in my records. So Hamilton College got $400, and then a huge coup. All of the SWIP divisions voted to attach Hypatia subscriptions to their membership dues. It was fantastic. See, we were thinking all along that this was a transitional phase to try to make us more attractive to a university press. We knew we wanted to show that we were successful as an autonomous journal. That was always going to be transitional. Phyllis Hall at Pergamon Press was wonderful to us. They mailed out 9,000 brochures, and they mailed them to the mailing list, the subscriber list from Feminist Studies. They gave us their subscription list. Signs, University of Chicago Press gave us their subscription list. National Women's Studies Association gave us their membership list. I had computerized the SWIP mailing lists. They had all been handwritten, I remember. I got them computerized. You had to send them to the local data processing office at the college. Anyway, Phyllis, I thought it was so generous that Pergamon Press backed us that way. And it was really because of women's studies. They were feminists. University of Illinois Press, Cornell University Press, bought ads in our first autonomous issue. That was very exciting. There's pictures of the brochures that we used. I noticed them in the room that we were in the other earlier. There was Aubrey Beardsley, is that the name of the artist? We had gone to a professional graphics company in town, and we were trying to put together a campaign, and there was this one sort of orgasmic-looking woman, and Joyce loved that one, I remember. And she has her hand on her breast, and there was this young man in the graduate program at SIU. At that time, we had a master's program in philosophy, and he said, "Oh, is she touching her breast?" He was appalled. And then that was our first subscription marketing campaign. I got lovely cards from people around the country saying, wow, they love that subscription campaign. And then I had a girlfriend whose name was Maureen Kinsella. She was a feminist artist, a graphic artist, and photographer on the faculty at SIU back then. And she said, you need to get more of a unified image for Hypatia. We had this sort of picture of Athena or something on the first issue. It was very elegant, but totally unrelated to that sort of orgasmic picture. So she said, I'll do it. Hypatia, it has to focus on Hypatia. I thought something very elegant, and what she did is she got my student, Thariah Halhul, whose parents were both in the dental school. They're both from Egypt. She's 100% Egyptian. Thariah was a women's studies major in philosophy, too, at SIU. She came to the studio, and my God, Maureen had a blue bed sheet. I'll never forget it. I thought, this is going to look awful. She wrapped Thariah in that blue bed sheet and plopped a couple of beautiful brooches on her shoulder and a ribbon around her hair, and we had Hypatia. I couldn't believe it. There she is. We had some wonderful recognition that just helped us so much. The two people, let me back up just a second. The two people who worked so hard as editors at Penn were Donna Catadall, does that name sound familiar? And Ruth Schwartz. They were wonderful with us. They helped with the transition. They were wonderful editors. They were the people who Aziza was trying to think of. Anyway, they had approached Dick Linebeck at Philosophy Documentation Center about indexing Hypatia, but it was extremely difficult for them to do it while it was part of Women's Studies International Forum. But as soon as we started announcing that we were spinning off, he was so nice. It was in August of '85, just the year after we started this effort of spinning off, that he wrote me a letter saying, this is how we propose to index you, this is how we propose to list you. It was wonderful. And then, we had a review in Choice. Choice is a publication of the Association of College and Research Libraries. It was a wonderful review, and it talked about Anne Ferguson's issue. That was my first special issue. It was on motherhood and sexuality. I loved that title. And anyway, it was a wonderful, it's indispensable for any serious, feminist research. It was great. I ran for a second 3-year term. I'd been elected for a 3-year term, and I thought, we're just getting going. So in '86, I was appointed to a second 3-year term, and I was a friend of Joan Catapano at that time, who was at Indiana University Press, and I knew her through National Women's Studies Association again. And she said they were launching a new journal division, and they were interested. So we developed a proposal for, by the way, by this time, we had incorporated. Whoa, ain't that fun, Allison? That is so much fun. In fact, when I announced to the provost at SIU Edwardsville that we were incorporating, she kicked us off campus. We had been there approximately 2 months, I think, and we started incorporating, and she said, all funding is now suspended. She thought they were going to own the journal. So I talked to a friend of mine who was a feminist lawyer, and I said, oh my God, what do I do? And she helped me. You write a letter about we at SIUE and they on the Hypatia board, the letter of my life. And funding was restored. Anyway, so 2 years later, we had a contract with Indiana University Press and Joan Catapano and so we succeeded in spinning off and establishing it as an autonomous journal and then having it picked up by a university press. Yes!
Linda Lopez McAllister, now about the term, the long term. Yeah, the extended term during which Hypatia was hosted at the University of South Carolina.
The way at that time to get to be a general editor of Hypatia, it seems, was to guest edit a special issue beforehand. And in, when was it, 1989, I believe, I guest edited the special issue on the history of women in philosophy. And I guess that proved to them that, I could edit an issue. And the next thing I knew, they were looking for someone to take over from Peg. And I guess I applied, and I got it. And by then, things were, pretty calm compared to what Peg had to do to get it off the ground. A couple of things that she failed to mention, and I was thinking about it the other day. one of the ways that they used to try and raise money in those years when they had $1,800 in the bank and a $6,000 printer's bill was to get any feminist philosophers they could find to do a lifetime subscription to Hypatia. And the cost of a lifetime subscription was $400. That's the best investment I ever made, because I'm still getting Hypatia all these years later. Anyway, so we took it over at the University of South Florida, and there's these wonderful posters out and about that show all the people who worked on it. And it was at South Florida 5 years under me, and then we kept it for another 3 years, but I was on sabbatical that in 1995, and I wasn't going to give up my sabbatical for Hypatia or anybody. And so Joanne Waugh and Cheryl Hall from the government department came in, and we became an editorial team. When we took it over, we started doing some special issues, which had become a tradition by then. And we did feminist aesthetics, ecological feminism, feminism and the body, philosophy and language, lesbian feminist philosophy, edited by Claudia Card. And one thing that's not on the poster out there, it wasn't exactly a special issue. We wanted it to be, but we didn't have enough stuff, but it was a special cluster in an issue. The first one on Spanish and Latin American feminist philosophy that Ophelia Schutte edited for us. And it went on and on and on. Feminism and peace, feminist philosophies of religion, feminist ethics and social policy, analytic feminism, the family and feminist theory, citizenship and feminism, identity, action, and locale, and finally we ended up, women and violence, and third wave feminism, and then we ended up with border crossings that Sandra Harding and Uma Narayan did, and that was a double special issue. So one wasn't enough. We had two different ones in 1989. I thought I would tell you about what I think is probably the most bizarre experience of a Hypatia editor. I don't know if it's true or not. Some of you may be able to top this, but in 1992, in the winter, I had a little cabin up in the woods outside Tallahassee, and I was up there one weekend, and I got a phone call, and I answered, and this man was on the phone, and he said, "Are you Linda McAllister?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad I found you. I'm a male lesbian, and I'm so happy that there's somebody who understands me." And I said, "Okay, would you like to tell me a little bit more about this?" Now, we had just published the special issue by Claudia, and in it was a paper by Jackie Zeta called "The Male Lesbian and the Postmodernist Body," I think it was, something like that. And at the same time that issue was coming out, the newspaper in Tampa decided that they would send somebody to do an article about Hypatia. And we thought that was really cool. Well, when does an academic journal get a newspaper to come to do an article about it? And it happened that we were working on the lesbian philosophy issue, and they took colored pictures, and they had pictures of the journal, including the latest edition, which was that of the lesbian philosophy one. And it was a very nice article, and the university was very pleased. But what had happened is that somebody, maybe there's a magazine called Florida Trend Magazine, which is a fairly conservative business kind of magazine. Some reporter for that magazine had seen the article about Hypatia and read the thing about the lesbian philosophy, and apparently he got a hold of it and saw this article about the male lesbian. And he called or wrote or somehow got in touch with Rush Limbaugh, and that's where it happened. And apparently, well, not apparently, Rush Limbaugh took out after us on his radio program, saying these wacko feminists, you know, on and on and on. And that's where this young man had heard about male lesbian. So I didn't quite know what to say to him, and I don't recall what I said to him. I was very nice to him, of course. But I thought, well, isn't that bizarre? Because, of course, Jackie Zita's paper came out saying it wasn't in support of the idea that there could be a social construction of everything, and she came out sort of against the idea of there being male lesbians. But the reporter didn't know that, and Rush Limbaugh certainly didn't know it. Actually, we agreed, or Jackie agreed with him that this was, no, Jackie didn't agree that it was a wacko idea. Jackie agreed that it was an idea that was worth pursuing and analyzing and arguing for or against. But I didn't actually hear Rush do that, because I figured, well, he's done it. But what happened is that he kept doing it for 5 days straight. Every day on that particular week, he brought this up and brought it up and brought it up. But it took another little turn, because then he started talking to the taxpayers of Florida. Do you realize that your tax dollars are being used to pay this woman? He didn't mention Claudia Card, he didn't mention Jackie Zita, it was Linda Lopez McAllister, who is, teaching your children this stuff. And then the phone calls began to come into the university. And so and I began to get a little bit scared for my job. The University of South Florida, 10 years earlier, had fired me from a dean's job in Fort Myers because they discovered that the person that I lived with, Sharon, who I still live with, was going to live, my boss came to me and said, how long is she going to stay? And I said, well, forever, I hope. And the next thing I knew, they said, well, Linda, we think that we need to do something else with you because there might be some sort of a scandal. So and what they did is they kicked me upstairs and sent me to Tallahassee to work as a faceless bureaucrat in the state education thing. So when the Rush Limbaugh thing came up and the people started calling the university saying, what, you're teaching this, blah, 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 I got kind of scared. But I must say that the university at that time did support me. And their PR people said, listen, this is going to blow over, don't worry about it, blah, blah, blah. And I thought it was over. The following year, at the time I was taking cello lessons, and I was playing the cello in an orchestra down at Sun City, Florida, and I was the youngest person in the orchestra because this is a retirement community, and I was like 50, and so I was the kid. And the people were really nice, and I really enjoyed it. And then the following January, I went to the orchestra rehearsal, and all of a sudden, all these people gave me the cold shoulder. What in God's name is going on? And this went on for a couple of weeks. Finally, the two liberal people in the orchestra took me aside and told me what had happened. We appeared in Rush Limbaugh's book. So he raised it again, and it's the book that was published in 1993, and here he is. Florida Trends magazine reported on this new discovery, first offered in Hypatia, the self-proclaimed Journal of Feminist Philosophy, edited by Linda Lopez McAllister, someplace. This scholar, quote unquote, and he goes on and on and on. So that was Hypatia's probably one moment of most enormous fame throughout the country, but not our most important moment for sure. But anyway, I thought you would like to know the story of Rush versus Hypatia. And so we went on until 1998, and then, ta-da!
Lori Schrag, our next speaker. Lori has just recently moved, a year or 2 years ago?
1 year.
1 year. A year ago, moved from California State Polytechnic University in Sonoma, which is where she was when she was editor of Hypatia and editor of Hypatia, to Florida International University in Miami, where she's director of women's studies and professor of philosophy. Lori served as co-editor of Hypatia with Nancy Tuana for a 5-year term, 1998 to 2000. during which the editorial office was hosted first at the University of Oregon and then at Penn State University. So Nancy was at the host institution and moved, and the journal moved with her. And Nancy can't be here only because there's some big deal fundraising and she's the director of the Rock Institute for Ethics, and I think there's a big deal event on. She knew about this like a year and a half ago, and there was no moving it, so that, sadly, she's not here. Lori has published widely over the years on reproductive rights and reproductive justice, on feminist debates about sex work and women's health issues. Most recently, she's just published a collection, edited a collection entitled You've Changed, Sex Reassignment and Personal Identity. It appeared just this last year, 2009. As she describes her interests online, and I think in the bio that's in your packet, they center on questions about how to realize viable progressive social policies on divisive issues in secular pluralist societies. May we have some success with that in the next few years. And these interests are well represented in her 2003 book on abortion and social responsibility and in Moral Dilemmas of Feminism. She's currently working on a number of projects related to You've Changed, this recent edited volume. And here are some titles. Does the government need to know your sex? Anatomy is not destiny. Sex, gender, and sexual orientation meet transgender studies.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here. I remember when I can still remember when you would go to APA conferences and you couldn't get together this many feminist philosophers in a room. And so it's wonderful to see this way out here in the Northwest that everyone got here today and will be here for this conference. When Nancy Tuan and I took on the editing of Hypatia, it was by then a thriving, established, and respected journal. By that time, we were about the fourth editorial team. You had Aziza and Peg and Linda. And so one of our first tasks was to renegotiate our contract with Indiana University Press, who was still publishing the journal at that time. To strengthen our bargaining position, we sought offers from other publishers, and we had no problem getting competitive offers. This substantially increased our ability to negotiate an increased share of the subscription revenues for running the journal office and for covering the costs that were not covered by our host institution, such as salaries for the managing editor and copy editors. There were actually a fair amount of subscription revenues at that point to argue over. And each time our publication contracts have come up for renewal after our term as editors, and while we were serving as associate editors, we had other publishers courting us. This has led, of course, to the journal's move from Indiana University Press now to Wiley-Blackwell. Although Indiana University Press very much wanted to keep us and made a very good offer, in deciding the future home of Hypatia, the associate editors and editors had to compare what kinds of support different publishers were able to offer for their journals. These days, this includes having a state-of-the-art technologies for electronic submission, for database management, and for electronic publishing, and all of that kind of thing that you're looking for now when you're publishing a journal. If you go online, by the way, I did this earlier today, on the Wiley-Blackwell page for Hypatia, the current issue that Allison mentioned, you can now actually download PDFs of the current articles, which is going to really increase Hypatia's reach around the world. Although we were and are we're extremely grateful to the editors at Indiana University Press, and especially, as have been mentioned, Joan Catapano and also Kate Carras, who Nancy and I mostly worked with, who supported Hypatia in its early years. It's truly exciting to see that Hypatia was now a title that publishers would strongly compete for. During my years as a co-editor and later as an associate editor, I was routinely contacted by other publishers who would ask to meet with me at APA meetings, and then typically during these meetings would ask if Hypatia would consider moving. Many of these publishers had begun to publish work by feminist philosophers, and were impressed both by the quality of the work and, of course, the sales figures compared to other philosophy titles. Given Hypatia's robust individual subscription base through SWIP, which has already been mentioned, and we also had a healthy number of institutional subscribers, libraries and so on, and given the republication rates of Hypatia articles in anthologies, textbooks, and course packets, which is a good source of revenue for publishers, Hypatia really no longer has to depend on the kindness of strangers or even friends. The position of the journal reflects, I think, the extraordinary intellectual work and writing of its authors and its contributors over the years. Although feminist philosophy and philosophers are not given enough respect by mainstream philosophy and philosophy graduate programs, one of the not well-known truths about feminist philosophy, at least I think to non-feminists, is that feminist philosophers are publishing up a storm of articles and books. When this fact is noticed by our mainstream colleagues, one often hears resentful comments from more traditional philosophers who typically cannot as easily find an audience for their work. I've often heard comments such as, well, you publish on such sexy topics, which of course we do, right, in many senses of that term. But such comments often carry the implication that feminist philosophers are pandering, right, to mass and even vulgar tastes. The work published in Hypatia is read by philosophers and scholars in related fields, but it also gets read by non-academics and by students in many fields. Yet the broad appeal of feminist philosophy is sometimes treated as an indication that feminist philosophy is not real philosophy. Of course, when philosophers find their position in the university questioned because of the apparent lack of relevance of mainstream philosophy, the APA doesn't mind turning to feminist philosophers to help expand the public's interest in philosophy. And we know that many people in this room have tried to help the APA and American philosophy in that respect. When Hypatia was honored as one of the best magazines or journals of 1986 and 87 by the editors of a publication called Library Journal, the paragraph about Hypatia ended with the comment, quote, "Academic and larger public libraries will want to subscribe to the only feminist journal whose focus is philosophy," end quote. This description of the journal's unique content is largely true today. While other philosophy journals include feminism as part of their self-description, such as the journal Radical Philosophy, Hypatia is the only international philosophy journal devoted exclusively to expanding and deepening work in feminist philosophy. Moreover, it is still the only feminist or gender studies journal with a primary disciplinary focus on philosophy. Although Hypatia has published work by feminist scholars who are not philosophers and also work that is interdisciplinary, the work published in Hypatia compared to other journals, some of you know, like Feminist Theory, a new journal, or the International Journal of Feminist Approaches to Bioethics, although these new journals have come along, they're, I think, more interdisciplinary, and so Hypatia is still the only feminist journal or women's studies journal that engages primarily with the discipline of philosophy. Hypatia, therefore, still occupies a unique niche, which is both a source of strength and responsibility. One question that comes up repeatedly in discussions at SWIP, Feast, and the APA, and other conferences where feminist philosophers gather is whether Hypatia can now manage to give enough voice to all the sub-areas of feminist philosophy and to all theoretical approaches, given how much good work is being done in all these areas. In introducing this, the selection of magazines and journals designated the best of 1986 and 1987 in the article I mentioned, the author who wrote that article, Bill Katz, writes, quote, "Of the 5,000 to 6,000 scholarly journals published in America each year," and this was in 86 and 87, there are probably 2 or 3 times that many now, only a few, this Bill Katz writes, only a few can be accused of discernment, wit, and original thought. He goes on, he says, "Most are responsive only to individual needs that may be somewhat less than commendable. The need of the author to publish in order to be promoted, the need of the editor and board of advisors to guard tradition, insuppressible notions of scholarship. And then he goes on to mention a few other bogus motives for academic publishing, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. That Hypatia was recognized in its very early years as an academic publication that was not primarily a vehicle for academic promotion or defense of the status quo disciplinary conventions, I think is quite an achievement. Unfortunately, publishing in Hypatia actually has not always served the careers of feminist philosophers. I've repeatedly heard stories of philosophy departments discounting articles published in Hypatia or telling their junior women faculty to be sure to publish in a real philosophy journal before coming up for tenure. This is despite the fact that Hypatia is peer-reviewed and is quite selective in what it publishes. Hypatia has been successful, though, at giving voice to non-traditional philosophical scholarship by expanding the kinds of questions philosophers address and the tools that they use to address them. Hypatia, I think, is also unique in academic publishing in that it reviews over 90% of the papers submitted and primarily omits from review or primarily omits from the review process only those papers that are neither feminist nor philosophical or do not follow the submission guidelines in some important respect, and every journal gets some of those. This is actually very difficult to do, and I'll have to talk to Allison whether they're able to keep this up, given the volume of submissions and the difficulty of finding suitable and willing reviewers. Nevertheless, a factor crucial to Hypatia's success is that it has provided feminist philosophers with critical and constructive feedback on their work. I always found it satisfying when authors would tell me that though their article was ultimately rejected, they found the reader reports extremely valuable and helpful in reworking their papers and ideas. Fortunately, some of those authors resubmitted their work to Hypatia, and it was eventually accepted for publication. For this reason, it's hard to imagine that feminist philosophy would have grown as such a dynamic field, I think, without this journal. I have to salute the journal's founders, who somehow understood the potential of feminist philosophy before much of it had yet been written or produced, right, or published. It's also critical to the success of both Hypatia and feminist philosophy were the founding associate editors who stayed on with the journal and provided their support and expertise behind the scenes. Especially helpful to me are some of the people in this room, Ann Gary, Sandra Harding, Helen Longino, and Ophelia Schuta. I don't know if Ophelia made it. I wasn't able to come. Without whom our job as editors would have been much more difficult and probably impossible. As Anne mentioned, these feminist philosophers would still be part of Hypatia's Associate Board of Editors if Nancy and I hadn't asked them if perhaps we should establish terms so that more feminist philosophers could be brought onto the board and then rotated off too, and onto because the Associate Editors is the official policy board of the journal. And of course, they all very readily agreed to this. But we've managed to keep them on as we create, as part of our advisory board, and we go to them for advice no matter whether they're going to have an official role or not, because all of these founders have just been crucial to success. Our panel was asked to address the future of feminist philosophy, and although this is too big a topic to address fully here, perhaps I should risk saying something about the future of Hypatia and its relationship to feminist philosophy. One issue that comes up again and again is what is Hypatia's international reach, and should it try to expand its international readership and subscriptions? As feminist theory moves more and more in transnational directions, this question, I think, will become more important. The answers here aren't easy, and this could involve questions from how much of Hypatia's content should be freely available on the internet, as some of it is now, to whether Hypatia's articles can feasibly be translated into languages other than English. Another issue, as I indicated earlier, is whether feminist philosophy has become really too large to have only one journal. Can Hypatia provide a forum for all the new and exciting work in feminist philosophy, Or is there now room for a journal that specializes in feminist moral philosophy or epistemology or analytic feminist philosophy, or perhaps a feminist philosophy journal that is more international and publishes in all the languages, perhaps of the International Association of Women Philosophers? If you think I'm going to answer these questions, I'm going to disappoint you. Maybe some of them will be answered at this conference, but I'll only venture to say that I don't think the answers are as obvious as some may think, and I think these questions should be debated. Fortunately, the journal has an energetic and resourceful editorial team of top-notch feminist scholars who, if they don't find the answers to these questions themselves, I think are advancing the debate, such as by hosting this really fabulous conference. And so I'd like to end by thanking them, and especially Allison for all of her work.
With founding a whole bunch of new journals. Let me just say, the journal is highly, I mean, we inherited a journal that is accepting 15% roughly of articles submitted for the open issues. We typically run to the tradition that we inherited that we're continuing with is that there are typically 2 thematic special issues a year. So that means the 100+ open submissions that come in over the bow, as Hilda Lindemann liked to say, are all being reviewed for all, but I think this year we only declined to review like 3. Yeah, looking at Laura. Yeah, we do review virtually everything that comes in unless it's just clearly extremely cranky, or just not in the area. The cranky bar is very high, right? Since our favorite feminists mentors are quite cranky, we appreciate there may be genius in crankiness. But we do, and what's really been just, in fact, Lori can probably speak to this more than me, because about half of the issues of the papers that come in are broadly value theory. So Lori handles the review process for them. And then overlapping, of course, continental theory would, of course, overlap, epistemology and many kinds of things in value theory, but there's maybe about a quarter, just under a quarter of those, and the rest, giving overlaps, would be and broadly epistemology, philosophy of science, metaphysics kinds of papers, philosophy of language. But we get astonishing reviews, and it's due to all of you. I mean, every paper is reviewed by at least 2, usually just 2. Sometimes we go to a tie-breaking review, but 2 referees. And we routinely get 1, 2+ single-space page comments, and they're really detailed, they're really tough, they're very constructive. I've never seen reviews like this. I mean, any other journal I've ever been involved in, I haven't sort of seen the overall editing of another journal, but I've almost never myself seen reviews of this quality. So we're definitely able to sustain that, even with a pretty enormous crush of papers, and with very high quality of responses. And when we write back and say, would you be willing to review again, almost invariably people say yes, and they do, and they write more detailed comments. It's astonishing. So we kind of blew Wiley Blackwell away when we went to visit them last year, at the point when we were meeting and the journal was moving and so on. We were setting up this electronic submission review system, and we wanted the sort of Cadillac version, because there were a number of functions we wanted in the system that they didn't really see why we needed. It's the sort of thing like, nature might have, or science, or 5 million submissions a year. And we were explaining the kind of review response we get, and the fact that we want to be able to trade them back and forth. And they finally sort of got back to us and said, okay, we'll do a special site build just for you, so you can do this. And I think they just had no idea what kind of journal Hypatia is, that it comes with this enormous community of support. So that's, anyway, just a few. And one thing, though, we do have terrific distribution subscriptions, but do please lean on your serials librarians to renew the electronic subscription to Hypatia. In the transition from Indiana to Wiley Blackwell, and we don't know exactly where this problem arose, many, many libraries renewed the hard copy subscription, but not the electronic. And so what Wiley Blackwell did was give free electronic access this year to all the libraries that renewed hard copy, but we need your libraries to renew. And it turns out that the best way to get a journal subscribed at a university is have faculty call up their librarians and say that they need it. So you'll find a handy little renewal flyer in your package. Don't throw it away. We need you to do this. Just to close, Hilda Lindemann can't be here. We got an email yesterday that she has a flu. And just really, really sorry that she's not here. And maybe we'll be able to convince her to do a video like Aziza did. That would be great. It would be wonderful. Just to say, she's professor of philosophy at Michigan State University, current president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. She served as editor, solo editor, and I have to say the three of us currently editing have absolutely no idea how she did it. I mean, it's just amazing. She served as the editor of Hypatia from 2003 to 2008. She's a prodigious and extremely talented and professional editor. She's co-edited with Sarah Ruddick and Margaret Urban Walker Rowan and Littlefield's Feminist Construction series, and she's the James Lindemann Nelson of the Reflective Bioethics series at Routledge. Hypatia got an extraordinary editor in Hilda, and we're the beneficiaries of 5 years of well-managed, fabulous intellectual content. All the content in the journal this year came to us from the Michigan State office, and there's lots and lots in the pipeline. Her own books include Damaged Identities, Narrative Repair, and Invitation to Feminist Ethics, and co-authored books, one on Alzheimer's, Answers to Hard Questions for Families, and on the patient in the family. These represent ongoing research interests focused on narrative approaches to bioethics, feminist ethics, the ethics of families, and the social construction of persons and their identities. And there's clearly a lot of that kind of content in Hypatia. It's one of the major sort of strengths and areas of the journal. So Hildy's not here. We should all. Can we thank her? We can't give her a hand. Give her a hand.
I've been an editor all my adult life, way before I ever thought of being a philosopher. When my children were very little, that was my cottage industry, was to diaper with one hand and wield a blue pencil with the other. And I freelanced for a number of university presses, and by the time I finished doing that part of my career, I had about 60 or 65 books under my belt. Most of those were titles in history, in English literature, in anthropology, a couple in philosophy, some in linguistics, German studies, things like that. So I had done that kind of work for a very long time. And then I had also, at the same time, always been interested in philosophy. I was kind of a fellow traveler, and I liked hanging out with philosophers. And so when my partner, Jim Nelson, got interested in some issues that were being discussed in the bioethics literature in the 1980s that he thought needed a feminist slant and should have it, he and I started talking about them, and I got very excited about this, and he did too, and he very kindly asked me to co-author a paper with him that had to do with that Mary Beth Whitehead case. So this was a case of contract pregnancy. And the paper was presented at the Feminist Conference in Duluth in 1988, I think it was. And Becky Holmes was doing a special issue of Hypatia at that time. And we submitted this for that. And we were accepted. I was thrilled because Hypatia was, of course, in those days as now, the premier journal in feminist philosophy. And I was terribly proud that I had been able to have a paper published there. And I read it faithfully. There were just so many interesting things going on in that journal, and it taught me an awful lot about feminist philosophy. So then, in 1990, it would have been, I was looking at a bioethics journal called the Hastings Center Report, and there were these two facing advertisements on the two facing pages. One of them was an advertisement for a philosopher on staff at the Hastings Center. The other one was for an editor at the Hastings Center Report. Jim and I looked at each other and said simultaneously, "I dare you." And we applied, and we got the jobs there. So then, for 5 years, I was an editor of the Hastings Center Report. There was not a great deal of room at the Hastings Center for feminist philosophy, for feminist bioethics, but there was Susan Wolf, who was a lawyer who is on staff there and is a prominent feminist philosopher in bioethics circles. And she put together a project in feminist philosophy. And I was one of the contributors to the working out of that project, to thinking it through, helping her organize how it should go, who should come, and so on. And again, I drew on the resources of Hypatia to help me figure out what I might be able to, what ideas I might be able to give Susan for organizing that. And again, Jim Nelson and I co-authored a piece that appeared in the collection that came out of that was an Oxford University Press book. So, but at that time also, there was a lot of ferment going on in feminist philosophy around, in particular, feminist ethics and social theory, or at least that was the piece of feminist philosophy that I knew the most about, partly because I was doing bioethics at the time, so that naturally would be something that interested me. But there was a conference in, I think it was 1993, that Iris Marianne Young threw, back while she was still at the University of Pittsburgh. And it was a marvelous conference. And I was excited because I wanted to contribute to it. And so I wrote a paper called Resistance and Insubordination, which I delivered at that conference. And then I was hoping that there would be a special issue of Hypatia that would accept that paper. Turned out they didn't. But what happened was actually even better, because they put it sort of in the general pool of papers to be reviewed for an open issue of Hypatia, and I got amazing feedback from the reviewers. The most generous, gracious, thoughtful, smart reviewers that you could imagine. And for someone who was just starting to find her feet as a very, very fledgling philosopher, I can't even tell you how much that meant to me. And I think that that is still true, that junior people who are just starting out, when they get really helpful feedback for how to make their papers better from anonymous reviewers, it matters a lot to them. It's really important. So, well then I, by that time, had figured out that if I was going to pursue a career in bioethics, I had better get a PhD in philosophy. So, because I had a day job in Briarcliff Manor, editing the Hastings Center Report, I trekked down to Fordham University because Margaret Urban Walker was there, and I had seen her do her stuff at various APAs and was really interested in that way of doing feminist philosophy. And so I said, "Margaret, teach me," and she said, "Okay." So by 2000, I had my degree, and I got a job in the philosophy department at Michigan State University. And Jim, of course, got a job there as well. And by 2002, the call came, as it does every 5 years or so, for a new editor for Hypatia. And Jim said, "Hilda, you're ready to do this. Why don't you put your name in the hat?" So I thought about it, and I talked to my department chair and said, "Well, you know, this would require institutional support from Michigan State if I were to do this. What do you think? And he said, sure, we'll find the money. So I put my name in the hat, and I was not chosen. The bid went to the folks at SUNY Stony Brook, Mary Rollinson, Eva Kittay, Linda Alcoff, and Kelly Oliver. Were going to form an editorial team there and do that work. And so I thought, oh, okay, better luck next time, I'll try again, because I thought it would be interesting to do it. And I thought that maybe my 5-year stint of being a journal editor at the Hastings Center Report would be useful experience and background. And so what I did instead was to edit a couple of book series. In fact, one of them was one that Jim and I did for Routledge back in the late 90s. That one was a series in bioethics called Reflective Bioethics. And that was great fun too. We really enjoyed that. Series editing is quite different from journal editing, but it's editing all the same. All the same, it's the same kind of where you work hard to put somebody else's work in its best light to make it happen. And that is a joy. It's a real pleasure to be able to do that kind of work. So then when I was at Michigan State University, our former editor at Routledge had decided she was going to move over to Rowman and Littlefield, and she asked me if I would edit a book series there, and I said I will if I can have a co-editor, and I asked Sally Ruddock to be my co-editor, and Sally and I edited the Feminist Construction series for Rowman and Littlefield for a number of years. We later added Margaret Walker as our third editor. So I was just doing that kind of stuff, figuring, okay, next time I'll do Hypatia if I get a chance, and put in for it again. And then I got a call from Ann Gary. That was the summer of 2003. She asked, maybe it wasn't a call, I think maybe it was an email, and she said that the Stony Brook team was not going to be able to do it because Linda Alcoff wasn't going to be there, Mary Rollinson wasn't going to be there, Kelly Oliver was chair of the department and very busy with that, and that really basically left Eva Kittay holding the baby, and they just didn't see how this was going to work. So would I reconsider, would I be willing to take it on anyway? And I said, sure, I'll take it on. And I have to say, Eva was fabulous about helping me get up and running really fast so that we wouldn't miss any issues of the journal, that everything would go smoothly. And then the other person who was really amazingly helpful was Kate Karras at Indiana University Press. She was the in-house editor of the journals there, and she was just lovely to work with. I think she appreciated my experience, and I really appreciated her savvy and good judgment. Another really helpful person at that point was Nancy Twana, who gave me a lot of help in getting the files organized, getting everything going. So then, we were up and running pretty quickly, and I thought I'd like to do a couple of things to the journal. One is I'd like a new cover for the journal. Kate Karras said, yeah, fine, let's put a new cover on it. So I hired a freelance designer who just happens to be my son-in-law, and he's very talented. And he put together the cover that Hypatia had from 2003 to 2008. I think it's beautiful. I really have always liked it. The other thing that I did to change it, aside from giving it a facelift, was to inaugurate a new column, the Musings column, which was strictly by invitation only. I would invite the best writers I could think of and the most creative feminists that I knew of to just muse on something or other, anything that was on their minds. And I think that readers have enjoyed that feature of the journal. But of course, the other thing that we did was to make sure that the review process stayed tight. The turnaround was never more than 4 months, because we kept making sure that reviewers stayed on deadline to get their reviews back to people. The reviewing has always been anonymous. The authors don't know who the reviewers are. The reviewers don't know who the author is, which I think is the best and fairest way for it to go. I also tried to make sure that during my time as editor of the journal, we didn't have too lopsided a table of contents. I wanted to make sure that all of the streams of feminist philosophy were well represented, that every kind of philosophy could be done in the pages of Hypatia, and that there should be a balance between new voices and mature voices in the journal. And some of that is done by using special issues. So we had a balance between open issues and special issues in the journal. Whether there was any particular development in feminist philosophy during those 5 years, I do not know. I can't tell yet. It seems to me that the field has ripened and matured to where you can't so easily say, well, this is the fashion now, or that's the hot topic of the moment. Because as any field matures, you would think that it would diversify, that it would get more general, that it would deepen as well as widen its range. And I think that really has happened in feminist philosophy. Those were exciting, vigorous years. I enjoyed myself immensely.